On November the 21st, 1884, with the noon thermometer outside Pemberton General reading 21 degrees Fahrenheit and a north wind scraping Sage Hollow street like a file over bone, Travis Coleman unloaded salt instead of lumber. He had learned the settlement's shape quickly in his first weeks there. A shallow Wyoming basin east of the Wind River Range, 7 years old by local telling, with one broad street, one store, one schoolroom, one blacksmith shed, and a confidence he did not share going into winter. Freight teams had arrived that week from the railhead with window glass, paint tins, milled trim, cast stoves, and bolts of wallpaper, and men in new gloves had paid cash for each sign of refinement. Travis had paid for coarse Liverpool salt, barrel after barrel, until the wagon bed showed white dust in every crack, and his coat sleeves looked as if they had been rubbed in frost. He was 32 years of age, broad-shouldered from harbor work, and marked by the quiet economy of a man who measured labor in calories and daylight rather than in opinion. He had come from Finnish winter country along the Gulf of Bothnia, crossed by a packet ship, and then by 2 rail lines with one trunk, one iron kettle, one roll of knives wrapped in sailcloth, and his mother's rules repeated so often that they had become a kind of internal ledger. Walls without preserved food were decorated hunger. Early frost did not announce itself for drama. It announced itself for arithmetic. A pretty room did not boil broth in January. Those sentences had been spoken first in a low timber house where 3 famines had taken neighbors, one after another, years apart, and where she had taught him to salt fish by weight, to judge brine by egg float and fingertip sting, and to distrust any autumn that felt generous. She had died in late spring of 1881, after a lung sickness that gave no remedy enough, and before she died she had made him repeat the chain in plain words. Her mother learned from her mother, and now he would carry it farther west where cold had new names but old habits. As he rolled the last barrel down a plank and wiped his gloves clean, he heard 2 men by the hitch rail laughing over porch brackets and paint colors for houses not yet boarded tight. He said nothing to them. He only looked once at the sky, pale and hard as hammered tin, and pictured shelves filled before deep freeze set in. The lot Travis purchased in Sage Hollow sat against a cut bank of hard-packed earth and gravel, a parcel others told him to avoid, because spring runoff chewed at the north edge, and because the ground sloped enough to complicate a frame foundation. He paid $28 for it in October and signed without bargaining, while 2 other buyers took corner lots near the church and boasted of porch depth and painted shutters. Within 3 days he had marked an oblong excavation 24 feet by 16, with a 6-foot entry trench on the lee side and a separate shaft for cellar access, then hired 2-day laborers at $1.25 each to help him break the first layer. From comments passed to him at the mercantile and at the pump, he understood how it looked to others, a man digging into earth, while everyone else reached upward with pine studs and nails. He did not answer those comments. He checked soil moisture in his own hand before each lift and kept a drainage swale 2 hand widths lower than the cellar floor. His dwelling rose low and severe over the next 5 weeks, built not to impress but to hold temperature. Sod blocks cut 18 inches long and 10 inches deep were laid in staggered courses over a fieldstone base, with each wall carried to 2 feet thick and chinked by clay mixed with straw chopped to thumb length. Interior braces came from reclaimed cottonwood posts, not new-milled boards, and the roof was layered in poles, brush matting, packed earth, and a final cap of sod that would freeze as one unit and shed wind. He set the entrance on an angle to prevent direct drift loading and hung a double door arrangement with a dead air pocket between outer and inner planks. Beneath the sleeping room, he lined a root cellar with flat stone and lime wash, 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, and a little over 7 feet at the center arch. Then installed cross-vent tubes of stovepipe set high and low, so air could be regulated without opening the hatch. Each choice came from remembered winters where a single draft could spoil a month of labor. Money in Sage Hollow was discussed openly at the stove, and by mid-November, Travis could hear his own spending recited by men who had never seen his ledger page. He knew the figures exactly. $112.40 spent before first snow, with $49.10 on salt and transport fees, $14 on 6 oak barrels of 40-gallon capacity, $7.60 on iron hooks and hanging chain, $9.25 on kettle lids and replacement hoops, $6.80 on lime, $5.40 on tools and whetstones, and the remainder on lamp oil, coarse flour, beans, and labor wages. Milled lumber received almost nothing beyond salvage planks for shelving. Horace Pemberton, proprietor of Pemberton General Mercantile and informal authority over most decisions that involved credit, began calling him the salt fool in evening conversation, where men warmed their boots and compared purchases. Horace had a heavy watch chain across a good vest, broad cuffs that stayed clean, and a practiced tone that made certainty sound like civic duty. "A man may eat his house in theory," he said one night beside the stove, loud enough for the entire room. "But if he lives in a dirt bank, he has mistaken hardship for wisdom." The phrase traveled by laughter from counter to church steps, and children repeated it in sing-song when Travis passed with sacks on his shoulder. He did not answer publicly. He worked. By the first week of December, he had begun the routine he trusted most. Behind the dugout, he set 2 slaughter frames of peeled lodgepole, each 7 feet high, and a cutting table from green cottonwood, scrubbed in lye water and sun-dried. He tested brine ratios with a hanging scale brought from Minnesota freight stock, balancing meat to salt at roughly 10 pounds to 1 by weight for heavy cure, and adjusting downward for shorter holds. He drilled drainage bungs in each barrel at measured heights, so spent brine could be drawn and refreshed without lifting entire loads. The cellar shelves were set 15 inches from wallstone to allow air movement and prevent hidden frost pockets. He packed the floor with tamped clay and ash to discourage rodents, stored onions and turnips in separate bins to avoid cross-taint, and hung a strip curtain at the inner cellar mouth to keep temperature swings narrow during frequent access. On trips into town for nails or lamp oil, he passed framed houses with sawn rails and painted trim along the ridge road, bright in white and green and red. His own place, low under sod and wind scoured already, looked to him as if weather might pass over it and leave it standing. By Christmas Day, with church bells muffled by a fresh 2-inch snow and ox breath hanging in the morning like steam from kettles, Salt Fool had become a public label rather than a private slight. Horace used it in front of customers. Teamsters repeated it in the freight yard, and one elder asked that Travis refrain from alarmist talk during Sunday fellowship, lest younger families lose heart. Travis gave the elder a respectful nod and offered a plain reply that several men standing near the church door heard clearly. Let them talk. Words do not keep meat from rotting, and they do not keep children warm. Then he returned to his barrels, his hooks, his measurements, and the hard discipline of preparing for a winter that had not yet declared its full intent. That evening the wind turned hard out of the northwest, and by dawn on December the 26th, the thermometer nailed beside Horace Pemberton's freight door stood at 4 degrees below zero, with powder snow driving low across Sage Hollow until the street itself looked plain flat and empty. Men who had joked at the stove the previous night now leaned their shoulders into drifts to reach their own woodpiles, and women shook frost from quilts in doorways while scanning the sky for a break that did not come. It was not yet the winter that would later be remembered in church records and graveyard reckonings, but it was enough to expose a simple division already present in the town. houses built to be seen, and stores built to be eaten. Travis Coleman rose before light, lit his small stove with split cottonwood and dung cakes kept dry beneath his roof ledge, checked the cellar vent draw with a tallow flame, and walked his barrel line with a notebook board in his mittened hand. Salt crust had formed evenly along the top rings. Brine stood clear. Meat remained sound. He wrote 2 figures in pencil, wiped the point against his thumb, and moved to the next cask while the wind beat steady against his sod wall and failed to find a seam. 3 days later, when the sky cleared to a pale metallic blue and the town resumed its ordinary noise, Reverend Amos Lyle stopped at the dugout entrance carrying a basket of cracked wheat and a question that had clearly been carried by others before him. He asked, not unkindly, whether Travis truly meant to live long in a house sunk into earth, whether a man did not owe himself at least one room with full windows and clean clapboard, whether such caution did not verge on fear. Travis invited him inside without ceremony, set 2 mugs of barley coffee on the table, and answered in the same measured voice he used for weights and measurements. Fear, he said, was building for praise from men who would not feed a family in February. Prudence was building for a month when wagons could not move and flour could not be bought at any price. The Reverend listened, looked once at the packed shelves and hanging hooks, and said only that Scripture praised preparedness when it was joined to charity. Travis nodded and replied that charity without stores was merely intention. In the long interior evenings of that first winter, as stove iron clicked and settled and snow hissed against the outer door, his mother's instructions returned with such exactness that they seemed less memory than method. She had been named Ino Lettinen before marriage, daughter and granddaughter of women who packed herring and whitefish and salt through Gulf winters where daylight narrowed and wind polished the sea ice like stone. Her lessons had never been offered as sentiment. They were arithmetic spoken while hands worked. For each 100 pounds of meat, 10 to 12 pounds of coarse salt when cold was uncertain. For brine barrels, scrub with boiled lye water, rinse twice, dry upside down, then smoke the interior lightly with juniper or alder to drive mold spores from the wood grain. For cellar air, always 2 paths, one high and one low, because still air betrayed food before smell reached the nose. When he was 12, she had made him salvage a spoiled fish lot alone after a thaw and refreeze, not from cruelty, but so waste would scar itself into memory. When he was 16, she showed him the difference between surface hardness and deep cure by slicing to the spine and pressing with the back of a thumbnail. When he was 28 and she began to cough blood into linen at dawn, she still corrected his brine by taste and told him that weather never negotiated. That final year, she repeated one instruction more than the others. Never confuse comfort goods with survival goods when coin ran short. By the first week of February 1885, with daytime highs hovering near 12 and nighttime dropping below 10 below on clear spells, Travis began planning a larger curing operation for the coming autumn because he could see what Sage Hollow refused to count. The settlement held 287 souls in the church census ledger, and most households still kept less than 2 weeks of preserved protein beyond flour and beans. Livestock numbers looked impressive in motion and sound, yet hoof and hide in a barn meant little if slaughter came too late or storage failed. He bought 3 additional barrels from a freighter passing through at $2.10 apiece, paying cash before Horace could raise the margin. He ordered heavy sack salt for spring delivery and paid deposit on 40 sacks at $1.05 each, contingent upon rail arrival before June mud. He salvaged iron strap from a broken wagon tongue behind the blacksmith shop and paid 60 cents to have it flattened into hanging cleats. In March thaw, he cut willow for rack frames, peeled the bark, and stacked poles under shade to season without checking. The town interpreted each purchase as further evidence of eccentricity. Horace did not need to speak loudly anymore. Repetition had done his work. At the pump, one woman asked another whether Travis intended to pickle the entire valley. Teamsters called his place the Burrow as if it were no dwelling at all. At church supper in late March, when seating narrowed and bowls passed quickly, Travis found no space at the long table until old Widow Keene moved her own plate and made room by her side. He thanked her and ate in silence while conversation flowed around him as if around a post set in stream water. The exclusion was organized less by command than by convenience, and convenience proved harder to challenge than open insult. By April, Horace refused Travis store credit for lampwicks despite extending it to men with larger unpaid ledgers, then remarked to two ranch hands that alarmist men should carry their own darkness. Travis answered this social narrowing as he answered cold, with procedure. He walked drainage lines after spring melt and deepened his north swale by 6 inches, where runoff had undercut the bank. He reset cellar stones displaced by frost heave and repointed joints with clay-lime mortar mixed 3-to-1 by volume. He installed a second interior shelf run, 9 feet long. From rough cottonwood plank he milled himself with pit saw and patience, because imported boards cost too much for hidden storage. He began a smoke trench behind the dugout in May, marking 14 feet from firebox to smoke chamber, with a slight upward grade so heat would thin before contacting meat. The trench walls were tamped clay, the roof a cap of split poles and packed earth 18 inches deep, enough to smooth temperature swings and prevent flare heat from hardening exterior flesh, while cores remained wet. At the chamber, he built a low shed framed with reclaimed posts and roofed in sod rather than sawn boards, because sod held a steadier interior near freezing in shoulder seasons, when nights still dropped hard. The door faced east, away from prevailing wind. He lined interior walls with lime wash and ash rub to discourage insects. Every hinge was oversized and hand-greased with tallow. By June 18th, after 2 delayed freight wagons and 1 argument at the unloading yard, his salt order had mostly arrived. 36 sacks came intact, 3 torn and resacked, 1 missing and credited in Horace's ledger only after insistence and witness. Travis weighed each sack on the public scale, recorded net pounds, and hauled the load in 4 trips by mule cart to his cutbank lot, where he stacked salt on plank risers 2 inches off the floor beneath waxed canvas to keep ground damp from climbing the fibers. He then purchased 2 slaughter gambrels at $1.30 each, 20 yards of coarse muslin for covering curing cuts, and extra barrel hoops from the blacksmith for emergency reband when staves swelled and shrank. Total outlay from March through July reached $63.15, a sum that would have raised a modest framed addition on many houses in Sage Hollow. He spent it on preservation instead. The first week of August brought dry heat by day and sudden chill by pre-dawn, and the basin grass took on that brittle silver cast that old drovers watched with narrowed eyes. Travis set 6 brine barrels shoulder deep in shaded ground to stabilize temperature, packing the surrounding soil firm and laying flat stones around each rim to keep runoff from clouding the brine after storm bursts. He tested salinity by float egg and by hydrometer tube. A traveling survey hand had traded for jerky years before, cross-checking both because broken glass could lie and floating shells could fool a tired man. He prepared cure mixes in separate bins for beef and pork, adjusting sugar and saltpeter ratios by weight, and intended hold time. His knife edges were reset each Saturday. Hooks were boiled, dried, and smoked. Nothing entered a barrel without inspection. Nothing left unmarked. By September 3rd, morning frost filmed the alkali edges west of town twice in 1 week, despite noon warmth near 60. Geese crossed high in narrow, urgent lines. Horses in open pasture carried thicker coats than the DAT warranted. Travis noted each sign in his board ledger and began visiting households in the outer blocks, not with speeches but with specific offers. Shared use of his cutting table, measured cure instructions by pound, and temporary barrel space for families short of containers. Some listened and thanked him. More declined politely, saying they would slaughter after the county fair wagons passed, after one more warm spell, after they had finished painting trim before weather turned. Horace, standing beneath the post office awning on market day, told a circle of listeners that panic spoiled livelihoods faster than frost, and that proper goods would remain available through autumn as they always had. He tapped his watch chain as he spoke and reminded them his shelves were full. On September 29th, with dawn at 29 degrees and a skin of ice over stock troughs before sunrise, Travis walked from house to house one final time and delivered the warning in plain figures. The North Platte spur was already delayed by washout repair. If heavy weather arrived early, winter flour and bacon might not arrive at all. Every family needed slaughter, cure, and cellar stockpiling now, while controlled drying remained possible and before hard freeze-trapped spoilage in place. He spoke this at the Barker place, the Pike boarding room, the Reed house, and finally in front of Horace's store where 24 settlers had gathered for mail distribution. Horace answered with practiced calm that had guided purchases for years, and many trusted that tone over the severe arithmetic in Travis's hands. The crowd dispersed toward ordinary errands. Travis returned to his dugout, checked his barrel seals again, and began cutting additional firewood to 4-foot lengths for shared hauling, because warning had ended and preparation had entered its final hour. He stacked the first rank of 4-foot billets under the lee wall, then the second, then a third set apart for households that had no able team in reserve, and before dusk he marked each pile with charcoal on thin pine slats, so no argument over ownership would rise when weather closed the roads. At lantern light he shifted to meat work, brining cloths in boiled water, weighing curing salt into 10-pound sacks, and writing clear instructions on scrap paper for families that had asked for measurements rather than opinions. One side of each paper carried numbers, not rhetoric, pounds of meat, pounds of salt, hours to drain, hours to hang, signs of sourness to discard without debate. The other side named the day and outside temperature at dawn, because spoilage followed weather more faithfully than intention. On September 30th, he opened his shed at first light and hung a chalkboard where any household could see it from the yard gate. He listed available barrel space by volume, cutting table hours by family name, and one strict rule that he repeated in person when needed: no carcass entered the curing run warm at the bone. He set 2 wash kettles at a rolling boil and kept them there with split cottonwood and sagebrush twists, rotating knives, cleavers, and hooks through steam and lye water in a rhythm that left little room for idle talk. The 6 sunk brine barrels stood shoulder deep in packed earth, ringed by stone, and by noon each held its first courses of pork, layered with salt in alternating bands 2 inches thick. He tamped every layer flat with a hardwood press, checked ring seals, and drove wedges where stave joints gave a whisper of light. By October 2nd, a Friday, the operation had widened from one man's reserve into a practical yard system that could have served a military post had anyone bothered to count honestly. Travis had built 3 hanging tiers inside the sod-roofed chamber, with iron hooks spaced 8 inches on center and ceiling poles rated by trial load to hold 2,000 pounds without bow. He cut airflow slots high on the east wall and low on the north, each fitted with sliding tin plates so draft could be narrowed during hard gusts and widened when interior damp threatened crusting. The smoke trench firebox took only dry hardwood chips and damp sage bundles, never green cottonwood, because acrid smoke sealed surfaces too quickly. and trapped moisture where rot bred unseen. He kept chamber temperatures between 34 and 38 degrees by opening and closing baffles every 2 hours, day and night, sleeping in 90-minute intervals beside a timer weight tied to a nail in the table leg. The costs continued to rise, and he tracked each coin without shame or concealment. 2 extra iron kettle lids from Cheyenne stock at $1.40 each. 12 yards of coarse canvas at 18 cents a yard for fly screens and draft curtains. New hoop iron for emergency barrel repair, 75 cents. A replacement adze handle, 20 cents. On October the 4th, he paid the blacksmith $3 flat to forge 6 additional S-hooks with widened throats for beef quarters, then paid another 40 cents to harden the tips so they did not deform under repeated boiling. Every expense was entered beside practical yield. Pounds cured, gallons stable, days of rations at winter allotment. When Widow Keene sent her nephew with 2 small hams and apologetic words for being late, Travis took the meat, trimmed only what had turned, and returned 1/3 of his own salt to her crate, so she would not begin the season in debt. As his yard grew more orderly, the town's contempt grew less casual and more organized. Horace Pemberton began refusing Travis common items that had nothing to do with credit risk and everything to do with social rank. First lamp wicks, then kerosene on market day, then 2 sacks of coarse flour that were sold moments later to men with larger unpaid tabs. He framed each refusal as policy, while his watch chain caught the stove light and his clean cuffs remained dry above the counter. A man who proclaims famine in fair weather cannot ask this store to underwrite his prophecy, he said one evening, loud enough for teamsters and ranch hands gathered near the Cracker Barrel. Several laughed. One repeated the old name, Salt Fool, with a new turn that carried farther, Berry Man Prophet, King of Barrels. By the first full week of October, exclusion had moved from jokes to institutions. 2 church elders visited Travis at dusk and requested, with formal politeness and obvious discomfort, that he limit weather warnings near the chapel steps because younger wives were becoming uneasy, and attendance had fallen at one Wednesday meeting. He offered them coffee, heard them out, and answered with a plain statement that held no heat. If I speak less, frost will not delay itself. If I speak more, wind will not obey me. I can only provide figures and tools. The elders left with that sentence and no further demand, yet by Sunday the seating pattern at fellowship supper shifted in a way everyone understood. Families that once nodded now looked past him. Bowls changed direction before reaching his end of the table. Old Widow Keene still greeted him. Reverend Amos Lyle still took his hand. Most others chose distance and called it order. Horace sharpened the edge in commerce. When the first freight interruption notice arrived from the North Platte Spur office, posted in small handwriting beside the mail slots on October 9th, he removed his spring salt stock from open bins and relabeled what remained in smaller sacks at 4 times his April price. He said transport risk justified the increase. He said prudent merchants planned for scarcity. He sold decorative wall paneling and varnish trim at full autumn rates the same afternoon, remarking that confidence was the best antidote to rumor. In lamplight, his shelves looked full. From the street, his store appeared unconquerable. Men who wanted to believe in appearance took those shelves as evidence that no hard reckoning stood near. Travis responded in the only language he trusted. He stopped seeking credit entirely, bartered smoked fish and labor for lamp oil, and rendered tallow at night for dip candles when wicks ran thin. He established a ration ledger for shared stock before any crisis declaration existed, assigning not favors but weights. 4 ounces dried meat per adult per day under moderate labor, 6 ounces under heavy labor, reduced allotments for those confined to stove duty, broth priority for elders and nursing mothers. He prepared mineral brine concentrate in stone crocks, labeled for dilution at 1 part brine to 6 parts boiled water, to prevent the weakness that arrived when winter diets thinned to flour and hope. He posted the formulas openly on his gate. Some mocked the board, a few copied it. A deceptive calm settled over Sage Hollow in the last week of October. 5 days of bright noon sun and weak wind that made ridge houses gleam as if spring had been misplaced on the calendar. Children ran without mittens. Men opened coat fronts while mending fence. Several households delayed slaughter again, saying the alarm had passed and that fresh killing in mild air spared labor. Carcasses were hung in sheds where daytime warmth softened outer layers and nighttime freeze locked that moisture inward. By smell alone, spoilage had begun in less than 48 hours in 3 yards west of the pump. Travis walked those lanes at dawn, said little, and pointed with his knife tip to gray-green bloom near a hip socket where airflow had failed. One ranch hand cursed the diagnosis and said he would cook through it. 2 days later, his dogs dragged discarded cuts from behind the barn. The warning signs multiplied with a precision that would have convinced any town trained to read land rather than mirrors. Geese did not merely pass south. They flew low and fast in narrow formations that ignored feeding flats. Muskrat houses along the alkali marsh stood unusually high, mud-capped above the previous winter line by nearly a handspan. Horses in open corrals turned hindquarters into evening wind before gusts arrived and kept heads low for hours. On October 12th, a pale ring formed around the moon before midnight, wide and hard-edged, while dawn broke with thin ice on trough water despite a noon high above 50 the day before. Travis collected these signs on his board and added one man-made indicator that mattered as much as any bird. The telegraph clerk received no freight confirmation for 9 consecutive days. He carried his notes to the post office porch on October 13th and read them aloud in calm sequence, then offered practical steps with no accusation attached. Slaughter immediately. Salt by weight, not by guess. Move flour from porch bins to interior barrels. Build interior sleeping partitions to reduce heated volume. Share labor with households lacking draft teams. Horace answered from the top step, hat brim dry in clear weather, and dismissed the list as catastrophe peddling. If fear had market value, Coleman would be our richest citizen, he told the gathered crowd. Buy what you need when true cold arrives. Do not waste stock in a panic stirred by marsh rats and bird flights. Laughter followed, though thinner than before. Several men looked at the ground while they laughed. On October the 15th, 2 days before the first blue front crested the western ridge, the last wagon from the south turned back at Bitter Draw and did not enter Sage Hollow. The driver sent word by rider that drifts had formed in cuts where no drifts should form that early, and that one mule had gone down in a wind gust strong enough to shove a loaded bed sideways. Travis received the message at dusk, then worked through the night rebanding 2 barrels whose hoops had loosened in the warm spell. He boiled spoiled scraps for hog feed, scrubbed all affected surfaces with lye and vinegar, and burned tainted cloths in a trench so no residue returned to the curing chamber. At dawn, he moved half his split fuel to the church basement under Reverend Lyle's supervision, stacked by row and measured by cord fraction, because shared shelter would soon require central heat, whether Pride approved or not. By October 16th, the basin held an uneasy brightness. Too clear, too still. The kind of stillness that did not soothe stock animals and did not fool men who watched pressure instead of sky color. Travis drove stakes from his dugout to the church, from the church to the Barker house, and from there to 2 adjacent homes, running tarred rope waist-high with knots every 6 feet, so gloved hands could count distance in whiteout. Nell Barker, 14 years old and steadier than many adults in that week, carried his written ration slips and fuel assignments from door to door, while older men argued on porches about dignity and overreaction. She returned near sunset with 3 signed acceptances, 2 refusals, and 1 message from Horace that no private system would supersede proper town authority. The Blue Front arrived before midnight, a low wall of iron cloud driving wind that struck clapboard corners like thrown gravel. And by first light of October 17th, Sage Hollow's painted houses stood exactly as they had stood the day before, handsome and upright and terribly unready for what had finally begun. By sunrise, the wind had stripped the street of all shape and driven snow hard against every west-facing wall, so that doors opened only by shoulder force and porch steps vanished beneath ridges packed like plaster. At 6 in the morning, Reverend Amos Lyle read -11 on the church thermometer. At noon, it read -16. The gusts, measured against the telegraph pole sway by the blacksmith and 2 freighters who had worked the Platte line for years, ran near 50 miles per hour and held there through the afternoon. Paint that had looked prosperous the day before now gave no advantage at all. Clapboard creaked, window putty cracked, 1 chimney cap tore free and cartwheeled into the lane behind the schoolhouse. Travis Coleman moved along the rope line before full light with a shovel in one hand and a covered lantern in the other, clearing knot points so gloved fingers could find them in whiteout. He checked each anchor stake by feel, drove 2 deeper where drift pressure had tilted them, and tied a second guideline from the church cellar stair to the Barker shed door, so fuel could be moved without crossing open street. Nell Barker followed 20 paces behind, carrying a waxed satchel of folded instructions under her coat and reciting household counts to him as if she were reading church roll. 6 at Pike Boarding, 4 at the Reed Place, 3 elders at Widow Keene's, 9 at the Lyle Parsonage after 2 families doubled up overnight. He answered each count with weights and hours. 4 pounds of broth cut for morning, 8 pounds smoked strips for evening boil, 2 wood sleds by noon if the drifts permitted. Horace Pemberton opened his store at 10 by force of habit and authority, though only a handful had reached the door. He stood behind the counter in a wool coat finer than the weather deserved and announced that provisions would be sold in controlled allotments to prevent disorder. The speech lasted less than 2 minutes before the first argument began, because flour sacks near the back had wicked damp from a roof seam and frozen in lumps. Lamp oil tins were fewer than expected, and 3 crates marked pork contained only nails and hardware ordered in September. The shelves still looked full from the stove, but full of wrong goods: hinges, kerosene chimneys, enamel basins, ledger paper. No household could stew a receipt. By October 20th, the first storm wave had not broken. It had thickened. Night temperatures held between -22 and -27, and stove drafts failed in houses with short flues because wind drove smoke back down faster than fire could lift it. Men who had prided themselves on trim carpentry spent whole mornings digging out their own doors. Women burned chair legs and crate slats to preserve cordwood for night. Livestock in open corrals turned their backs to the blast until ice furred their nostrils and handlers could not lead them to water without 2 ropes and 3 hands. The town still spoke of waiting it out, as if weather were an inconvenience with manners. Travis stopped arguing in public. He shifted to system. He moved 1 barrel of pork and half a barrel of beef from his dugout into the church basement, not because his own stores were at risk, but because distance killed in drifts and central distribution saved steps. He set a weighing station on the communion table base, laid a clean plank across 2 hymn benches, and marked rations in charcoal directly on the stone wall, so no page could be lost or disputed. Adults under light work received 4 ounces dried meat and 1 ladle broth each meal. Teams hauling snow or fuel received 6 ounces in thicker stock. Elders and the sick received broth first, solids second, salt water diluted to prevent collapse from weakness. Every allotment was recorded by household, date, and hour. The first brief easing came on October 24th, a half day of thin light and lower wind that tempted the town into misreading the scale of what had arrived. Men stepped out without face wraps. Horace reopened full hours and sold decorative oil lamps at reduced price to souls who wanted normalcy in hand. 2 families used the lull to move back from shared shelter into their own houses. Travis used the same lull to deepen the rope trench at 3 crossings, raise line height by 1 knot where drift crowns had climbed, and cut an additional 6 cords of mixed cottonwood and sage root, stacked under church eaves in measured rows. He told Reverend Lyle that the pause was too clean, too sudden, the weather equivalent of held breath. The Reverend nodded and sent Nell with notes ordering every household to remain linked to rope lanes after dark. On November 8th, the second surge struck with an authority the first had only announced. The sky lowered before dawn, and by mid-morning, Sage Hollow disappeared beyond 10 yards. Snow did not fall in flakes but drove as ground powder torn from one drift and hurled into the next. The telegraph line failed at noon, then again after a short repair, then went silent for the remainder of the storm run. Daytime temperatures dropped to -18, then -26 by evening, while wind held near 50 and sometimes rose above it in blasts that made walls tremble and doors breathe inward. The whiteout ran 3 weeks with only brief gray intervals that gave no safe passage beyond rope reach. Plans built on private pride failed in sequence. Porch roofs collapsed where wet early snow had frozen to hard load. 2 wells iced at pulley depth because covers had been left loose during the October lull. Flour bins in unheated sheds clotted and molded along the inner staves. Meat hung late and cured poorly turned rank despite freezing exteriors. Households cut away outer crust and found softness beneath. The schoolhouse stove cracked at the seam on the 10th day of the whiteout, and the room was closed. Families crowded the church cellar, Barker barn, and Travis's dugout annex in rotating shifts, so body heat could be pooled and fuel used where it mattered. The settlement that had praised spacious parlors now survived in narrowed rooms and shared kettles. Horace's authority diminished by arithmetic rather than insult. His account books remained tidy. His inventory did not. By November 12th, Pemberton General held mostly non-food stock and a few sacks of meal that had taken damp. He attempted paid distribution twice, first by posted price, then by credit ledger. But coin and signatures carried no warmth to a frozen pot. On the 3rd attempt, no one argued with him. They simply turned toward the church basement where Travis weighed rations without speeches. When Horace shut his store door that night, the latch rope had to be chipped free of ice with the heel of a hammer. 3 days passed with no wagon bells, no outside rider, and no sound after dusk beyond wind and occasional timber strain. Hunger altered posture first, then speech. Strong men sat rather than stood while waiting their turn at the broth kettles. Women who had managed households for years without error began counting aloud to keep order in tasks as simple as stirring or ladling. Children stayed near stove walls wrapped in coats and quilts, quiet not from obedience but from conserving heat. Travis and Reverend Lyle set watch rotations at 2-hour intervals to keep fires alive and vent pipes clear, because one blocked flue could end an entire room before dawn. Elias Crow died on November the 14th, and the manner of it stayed with Sage Hollow long after drifts melted. He had been a freighter by trade, 41 years old, known for mending harness with neat stitching and for carrying extra nails in his coat hem for other men's broken gear. During a gray interval that morning, he and 2 partners attempted to move a flour sack lot from a stranded sled near the north edge into church storage. They tied in, followed the rope line for most of the distance, then lost footing where a drift had buried one anchor and shifted the path 20 feet east. The other 2 reached the church wall and turned back with lanterns, but wind erased tracks as soon as they formed. Elias was found at dusk, 50 yards from the line, knees drawn under him, one hand still wrapped around a flour sack strap he had not abandoned. Reverend Lyle and Travis carried him inside on a door plank. The sack reached the scales first. Elias reached the pew row and did not rise again. On November the 17th, Miriam Pike succumbed to lung fever in the Barker front room after 6 days of hard breathing and little rest. She had taught reading in Sage Hollow since the settlement's second year, kept pupils after dusk for sums and penmanship, and, during the first storm run, had given her own meat allotment to 2 boarders whose father was pinned south with a stock drive. When fever took hold, she refused extra broth until the children and elders were served. Travis sent willow bark tea, hot stones wrapped in cloth, and diluted brine to maintain strength. And Nell sat with her through 2 nights reading from a geography primer when breath allowed listening. On the 5th night of the second surge, Miriam asked that her attendance ledger be delivered dry to the church cupboard, then asked whether the pupils had their copy slates. She died before dawn with her spectacles folded on the blanket beside her and both boarders asleep against the same stove bench she had kept warm for them. After Miriam's burial service, held in the cellar because wind made outdoor prayer impossible, no one in Sage Hollow spoke of overreaction again. The mood changed from argument to labor. Households that still held fuel disclosed it. Men who had mocked rope lanes now retied knots and widened trenches by instruction. Horace sent his clerk to request ration assignment for his own household, and, in the same note, asked whether decorative paneling from his back room might be burned for heat if cut to stove length. Travis returned a one-line answer through Nell. All dry wood served life before pride, cut and stack by dusk. By November 20th, with the whiteout still pressing and outside noon at -30, the margin narrowed to hours in several homes beyond the main shelter circuit. The reed stovepipe iced shut twice in one day and had to be cleared from roof level by 2 men roped waist to wrist. Widow Keene collapsed while hauling ash and was moved to church bedding near the kitchen wall, where broth could be served without stairs. The blacksmith split his palm to the tendon on frozen iron and could not work bellows for 2 days. Every difficulty multiplied because each strong body already carried 2 assignments. Travis answered by consolidating. He moved kettles from 3 stoves to 1 larger hearth, reduced water carry distance by setting snow melt tubs indoors, and issued labor cards in charcoal, so no household sent its only healthy adult on duplicate tasks. That evening, near full dark, Nell came down the dugout entry with frost rhyming her scarf and said Horace Pemberton was outside the inner door. He entered without his coat hat, as if he had forgotten both in haste, and the contrast between his former presence and his present state required no comment. His cuffs were frayed and smoke-stained. His beard showed ice at the chin. His hands shook from cold and depletion as much as age. He did not sit until Travis pointed to the bench. He said in a voice stripped of public performance that his wife had not kept broth down for a day, that his clerk had fever, and that his own stores were reduced to meal too damp to cook through. He added that he could pay, then corrected himself and said payment no longer seemed the relevant word. Travis filled a tin cup from the kettle and placed it in Horace's hands before asking another question. Then he set out assignments as he would for any household. 2 quarts clear broth tonight, 1 pound smoked beef shaved thin for morning boil, a rotation slot by the church stove for his wife, and a labor exchange of ledger skill for ration tracking once his hands steadied. Horace nodded once, looked down into the steam, and said he had called the dugout a burrow fit for animals. Travis answered without sharpness, "Tonight it is a kitchen. Tomorrow you will copy names and weights. Hold the cup with both hands so you do not spill your strength." Horace drank, then took the wrapped parcel and left by the rope line Nell held taut in the dark. Nell held the rope steady until Horace disappeared into the white, then came back down the entry with her face stung raw and her mittens stiff at the seams. Travis gave her the next slate of routes, added one extra stop at the Reed house for stove inspection, and sent 2 men ahead with a roof hook and iron rod. The weather gave no quarter that night. Wind pressed so hard against the church doors that the latch bar hummed, and snow found every nail hole in every wall that had been built for admiration first and endurance second. By November 22nd, the shelter system had become the settlement's true government. Horace sat at the church plank table beside the communion rail, copying names, ounces, and fuel turns, with a cramped hand that had once signed credit slips as though ink itself were authority. Travis dictated weights. Reverend Lyle checked household counts, and Nell carried folded ration chits under oilcloth from cellar to rope lane and back again. The expensive lamp chimneys in Horace's store remained on their shelves, clear and useless, while Travis's plain oak barrels gave up one measured day after another of pork, beef, and brine that kept hands moving and minds clear enough to work. That same night before dawn, word came in from the Reed house during a watch transfer. Their stovepipe had iced shut again between rounds. The room had dropped hard, and Samuel Reed was lost before help could be pulled through the lane. He had been born in August, small and alert, with a narrow cry that neighbors had joked sounded like a meadowlark. There was no joke in the cellar when Nell brought the message and Travis entered it in the casualty column before taking hot stones, blankets, and 2 men on rope to support the family. Abigail Reed did not speak for several hours. She only held the wrapped bundle while Reverend Lyle prayed without raising his voice. At first light, the town carpenter set aside sled repairs to build a pine box from cabinet stock intended for a parlor cupboard. No one objected to the choice of wood. 3 days later, during a brief gray lull, Travis began teaching in the same rhythm as feeding. He showed 6 households how to shave frozen smoked beef across the grain, so a 1/4 pound could stretch through 2 kettles without turning stringy. He demonstrated how to thin emergency pickle brine 1 to 6 with boiled snow water to preserve strength when flour was the only other meal. He required every able adult to learn vent clearing, ash management, and the smell that warned of damp meal rot before mold surfaced. Horace attended each lesson, wrote each ratio twice, and corrected younger men who guessed at measures. Pride had not vanished in Sage Hollow, but hunger had forced it into useful channels. By the first week of December, with the whiteout still striking in pulses but the worst force spent, the rope network stretched farther than any original plan. 12 homes tied into the church line. 3 shared stoverooms operated on rotation. Fuel cards in charcoal tracked cut, stacked and burned loads by half-chord fractions, and arguments that might once have become feuds were settled by the ledger and the scale. Travis moved his last sealed barrel from private cellar to public ration, then opened his own flour sack lot to households with infants and elders first. He took no extra portion for doing so. He slept when others slept, rarely more than 2 hours at a time. On December 3rd, the storm broke at last into a brittle blue cold, -20 at dawn and almost windless, and Sage Hollow stepped outside to count what remained. Drift crowns stood shoulder high against church walls and reached second step height on porches that had been swept clean each morning in October. Roofs had held where load had been cleared. 2 sheds had collapsed. 1 barn had split a corner post. The dead were named before work resumed: Elias Crow, Miriam Pike, Samuel Reed, and 13 others whose losses came by fever, exposure, and failed lungs during the long confinement. When Reverend Lyle updated the church roll in late winter, the number read 271 souls. No train reached the North Platte Spur until March 19th. when a repair crew cleared the washout and telegraph traffic resumed in uneven bursts. The message that finally arrived from Cheyenne did not bring apology, only dates, freight delays, bridge damage, estimated resupply. Horace read the paper twice, then pinned it beside his own store notices where all could see that Travis's warning had matched the line schedule exactly. He did not remove the sheet afterward. It yellowed there through spring mud. As roads softened and sunlight lengthened, the reckoning in Sage Hollow did not begin as a single dramatic declaration. It began at doors. Men who had laughed near the stove came to the cutbank lot, carrying split posts, hinge straps, and awkward silence. Women who had passed bowls away from Travis at fellowship supper came with seed potatoes, mended cloth, and plain words that did not ask to be admired. Some apologies were spoken badly but sincerely. Some were spoken through labor alone. Horace came on April 6th with his account books under one arm and a sack of coffee under the other, set both on Travis's table, and said he had profited in October while risk rose for all, had quadrupled salt in a season when salt was life, and had called skill by the name of folly because his own authority required an audience. He requested instruction before next winter and said he would accept refusal if refusal came. The formal meeting followed on April 18th in the church, after roads opened enough for outlying families to attend. Snow still lay in gray strips along north fences. Mud clung to boots in thick plates. Reverend Lyle stood first and read the winter numbers as though reading names at burial, then yielded the floor to Horace Pemberton. Horace spoke without store tone, without watch chain certainty, and without excuse. He said he had mocked a man who was measuring survival while he sold appearances. He said he had called Travis salt fool, had encouraged others to repeat it, and had mistaken full shelves for secure households because he valued what looked prosperous under lamplight. He said he had charged fourfold for salt at the moment transport failed, and that this act had not been hard commerce but moral failure, because he knew many families would buy paneling before provisions if guided to do so. He said plainly that he had led neighbors toward hunger and would carry that knowledge as long as he lived. After Horace sat, others stood in turn. A ranch hand repeated his own porch joke about the burro man and could not finish his final sentence without stopping to steady his breath. One church elder admitted he had asked for silence when warning was needed. A mother from the Ridge Road said she had chosen painted shutters over barrel staves in September because she wanted one visible sign that her family had risen and that Miriam Pike had given her children food when she could not. No one defended those choices. No one applauded the admissions. The room held the sober stillness of a place where fact had finally outrun vanity. When Reverend Lyle asked Travis to answer, Travis stood with both hands on the back of the pew before him and kept his voice low enough that the room leaned in. He said his mother had taught him in Finnish winter country that cold did not rank souls by respectability, and that weather had never once asked who won an argument in October. He said words had harmed him, yes, and exclusion had cost time, when time was the one thing the town never had in reserve. But he had not salted meat to collect apologies, and had not dug earth walls for vindication. He said forgiveness, if that word must be used, could not be a sentence spoken once in April, and then forgotten by August. It had to be measured like brine, checked like vents, and renewed before each frost. He then gave the only terms he offered: a shared curing house built to specification by July, 2 communal root cellars completed before September 15th, a standing salt cooperative with fixed prices posted publicly, and mandatory ration drills in October for every household, including his own. "If you wish to honor the dead," he said, "learn the work that might have kept them. I will teach any hand that shows up." No one asked for easier terms. By the second week of May, teams were hauling fieldstone to a lot behind the church where the shared curing house would stand. Travis marked out 28 feet by 18, with dual vents, raised hook beams, and a smoke trench grade of 1-inch rise per 3 feet run. Horace sold his decorative lumber stock at cost and put the proceeds, $186.70, into barrel purchases and coarse salt contracts locked at spring rate under written witness. The old derisive name changed by common use without formal vote. Children no longer sang Salt Fool in the lane. They said when a wall was thick and a cellar deep, that someone had built like Coleman. 20 years later, the sod cellar at the Cut Bank still stands in winter service, its stone lining cool in July and steady in January. And the cooperative board inside the former church annex still posts salt prices each spring before any paneling order is accepted. Sage Hollow records 412 souls now, with larger barns, better roofs, and less appetite for show without reserve. In the school primer revised in 1906, Miriam Pike's attendance ledger is copied on the first page of the winter chapter, and beside it appears a practical table of cure weights that Horace once transcribed under Travis's direction with fingers still scarred by cold. Visitors see ordinary frontier structures and a town little different from others at first glance. Residents see ratios, rope points, vent paths, and stock rotations hidden inside that ordinary appearance, and they teach their children the rule that ended one costly arrogance. Walls may keep out wind, but only prepared hands keep hunger out. That rule is written in chalk each October on the wall of the shared curing house, and on the first Monday after harvest in 1906, the children copy it into their winter notebooks while Travis Coleman checks the scales with a 1-pound iron weight, worn smooth by 2 decades of use. The old weight balances true. The beam settles level. Along the east wall, the original oak barrels stand in numbered order, hoops replaced where needed, staves tight, lids scrubbed and smoked in spring exactly as Ino Lettinen taught her son before Sage Hollow had a name in his mouth. No one calls them foolish now. They are municipal property, logged by date and lot number in Horace Pemberton's careful hand. At noon, with outside air at 19 degrees and a thin wind moving from the ridge, Horace brings the cooperative ledger to the table and reads prices aloud for all to hear. Coarse Liverpool salt at $1.12 a sack, no emergency surcharge permitted between October and March, barrel rental at cost, and credit extended first to households with infants, elders, or injury. He is heavier in the face and slower in the knees than he was in 1885, but his voice does not drift when he reaches the line that once shamed him. Appearance goods remain appearance goods, he reads. Preservation goods remain survival goods. The order shall not be reversed. No one smiles at the phrasing. They record it. That afternoon, Nell Barker, now schoolmistress Nell Barker Keene, unlocks the cedar chest that holds Miriam Pike's attendance ledger, wrapped in cloth and kept dry since the night Miriam asked for it. She sets it beside the revised primer and calls 6 older pupils to the front bench. Travis stands near the stove, hat in both hands. Horace stands at the door with 2 fathers who were boys during the whiteout. Nell reads the names of Elias Crow, Miriam Pike, and Samuel Reed first. Then the other 13 lost that winter, and each child answers, "Present in memory." The room is still except for stove tick and pencil scratch. When she is done, she points to the next page, where cure ratios are printed in large type. "You will learn both lists," she says. Names without method become grief repeated. 3 days later, a dry north current drops the dawn to 8 below, and the first annual rope drill begins before sunrise. Travis no longer cuts every trench himself. He assigns teams by age and strength, then walks the line with a measuring staff, checking knot spacing at 6 feet, Stake depth at 30 inches and lane width at 24 inches where drifts commonly crown. New settlers from downstream, 12 souls who arrived in July with bright clapboard and optimism, watch in uncertain silence until Horace hands them shovels and points them to the church turn. One of the newcomers, a carpenter named Joel Rusk, asks whether such labor is needed before snow even flies. Horace answers in a tone heard clearly by every team in range. In this town, we prepare before weather asks the question. I learned that by failing my neighbors once. You will not need to fail them in order to understand. By the second week of October, smoke trench fires are tested, vents cleared, and all 6 reserve barrels filled to marked lines with brine checked by hydrometer and egg float both. The old telegraph notice from March 1886, yellow and brittle, is brought down from the board at Pemberton General and moved to a glass frame in the church hall beside the casualty list. Its message is simple. Freight delayed. Bridge repair incomplete. Resupply uncertain. Below it, Reverend Amos Lyle's successor has pinned a card in plain script. Warnings arrive in many forms. Read all of them. On October the 28th, 1906, geese cross low over Sage Hollow in narrow, fast bands, and muskrat houses on the marsh stand high above the previous line, mud-capped hard. Children point and call out each sign by name because they have been taught to do so. No one laughs. At sundown, Travis makes one final walk past the row of improved houses, now better built than the early painted shells, and checks the external vent caps with a lantern and pole hook. At the Reed place, Abigail Reed, hair gone gray at the temples, opens her door before he knocks and says the words she has said every autumn for 19 years. Vent clear. Pipe brush hung by the stove. Night watch set in pairs. He nods once and marks her house ready. The storm that follows on November 2nd does not match the ferocity of 1885, but it is severe enough to test memory. Wind runs near 40 miles per hour and holds for 2 days. Temperatures sit between -12 and -20 at dawn. Drifts block the south lane by midnight. Yet no household is isolated. Rope lines are already in place. Fuel cards are already posted. Broth kettles are lit in 3 shared rooms before first light, and ration distribution starts at 6 with weights called aloud by 2 voices, one reading, one verifying. So fatigue cannot bend arithmetic. Joel Rusk's youngest daughter develops fever on the 2nd day, and the family reaches church shelter by rope in 9 minutes because Nell and 2 older pupils have drilled that route twice each week since September. In the church basement, Travis teaches while he serves. He demonstrates again how to shave smoked beef against the grain to increase surface area for quick extraction, how to dilute mineral brine without overdosing salt, how to smell damp flour before mold threads show. Abigail Reed stirs the elder kettle. Horace records ounces and fuel fractions in columns that leave no room for prideful misremembering. When a newcomer asks why the cellar doors are double hung with an air pocket, Nell answers before Travis can speak, giving dimensions from memory, then adds, the walls held because someone measured when others decorated. On the evening the wind drops, the town gathers by custom, not compulsion, in the same church where confession once carried more weight than comfort. There is no dramatic tribunal. There is a ledger table, 3 lamps, and a line of households waiting to sign for what they borrowed and what they returned. Physical accounts close one by one. 2 barrel hoops cracked and replaced. 1 hydrometer tube broken and paid at cost. 14 pounds of beef issued above standard to fever households, approved by vote. The last sheets from Horace's old private debt books, those winter pages where impossible charges had once been entered for salt, are brought forward at his own request. He reads the entries aloud, names each unfair increase, and marks them canceled in red while witnesses watch. Then he folds the pages and places them in the stove, not as theater, but as record completed. After the signatures, Joel Rusk steps to the front and speaks toward Travis with the unease of a man who has seen his own ignorance in clear light. I arrived with tools and assumptions. I saw the low roofs and thick walls and thought them remnants of a poorer age. I was wrong in craft and wrong in character. Your work fed my family before I had earned standing here. I ask instruction, not pardon. Travis answers as he has answered for years, neither softening the cost nor sharpening it for display. Instruction is available at dawn. Bring your own notebook and your own labor. Pardon is not a commodity I distribute. Responsibility is. No one mistakes him. No one argues. Near midnight, when most lanterns are out and only the kitchen stove remains, Horace lingers by the framed telegraph sheet in the casualty list, hat turning slowly in his hands. Reverend Lyle's successor asks whether he wishes the documents moved to archive storage for preservation. Horace shakes his head. Leave them where fresh eyes will meet them. Shame that remains visible can still perform useful work. It is the fullest statement he ever makes about his own loaded silences from that first autumn, and no one asks him for more. In January 1907, 22 years after the barrels first arrived in white dusted stacks, Travis stands with 12 children in the curing house and has them measure salt by weight, not scoop, then test brine both ways and compare readings. Outside, Sage Hollow counts 412 souls. Inside, the oak staves, fieldstone, ledgers, rope maps, vent diagrams, and names of the dead remain in active use, not preserved as relics but handled as tools. The old Cutbank cellar still carries potatoes, onions, and winter meat at stable temperature, and each spring the cooperative posts its prices before any household spends 1 cent on trim. When travelers ask why a frontier town keeps memorial lists beside cure tables and weather signs beside school sums, Nell answers with the same sentence every class can recite by heart. Because memory without practice is mourning, and practice without memory is arrogance waiting for snow.